Thank you. Okay, so welcome everyone to this week's CEN seminar. I am delighted to introduce Arnold Wilkins, who I met a few weeks ago when you were consulting on something you were doing for the Royal Society, I believe, and you got talking about your work, and I thought, well, we have to have you on the CEN seminar series, so thank you for agreeing. So just a bit of background about Arnold. He obtained a DPhil from Sussex University for work on semantic memory, and then spent 2 years postdoc at the Montreal Neurological Institute, which kindled his interest in epilepsy. He worked for 22 years at the MRC Applied Psychology Unit, which is now the CBU, and then moved to a chair at Essex University, where he's now emeritus. So his work on photosensitive epilepsy guided later work on visual discomfort and its management with coloured filters and association with metabolic load. So today he is talking to us about his research into vision and the classroom as an unnatural and uncomfortable environment. So a nice challenging topic. So over to you, Arnold.
Thank you, Rebecca. The talk I shall give is a vision of the classroom as unnatural and uncomfortable. And there's a double entendre there because it's my vision, but also the vision that you see when you go into a classroom. Now then, we're not advancing for some reason. How do I get to advance, Rebecca?
You should just be able to click on your slide.
I am, but nothing's.
Ah.
Oh dear.
Oh dear, oh dear. We should have run through this, shouldn't we?
Yes.
Right. Let me.
The whole thing's frozen.
Oh dear. So are you in Zoom or are you in PowerPoint?
I'm in Zoom, yeah.
Okay, I think.
Well, I'm in PowerPoint as well. Oh, there we go.
There you go. It's gone. Right. We're all
Excellent.
good.
So, a synopsis in a few lines. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you, and then I'll shut up. So, images from nature tend to be comfortable to look at, and I'll explain why that is. And scenes that are unnatural, that is, not scenes from nature, tend to be uncomfortable to look at. There are good reasons for that. We'll consider the various aspects of scenes from nature and show how classrooms are unnatural and therefore uncomfortable. So here we go. Oh, this really is annoying. I can't advance. Oh, there we go. I'll just have to use a different method of advancing. Okay, there's relatively little flicker in nature. Some people are sensitive to seizures from flicker, about 5% of patients with epilepsy. And there are only two types of image that they're susceptible to. One is sunlight interrupted by the leaves of trees, and the other is sunlight reflected from the surface of water. But there are other stimuli, visual stimuli, to which they're also sensitive, which I'll show you in the next slide, but some of you may be sensitive to these, so a warning, if you if you're sensitive to stripes, then cover one eye. Here we go. So this sort of pattern will also provoke seizures. So it's not just flicker that can cause seizures. About a third of patients are also sensitive to patterns. Now, the sort of patterns that can trigger seizures are very specific. The size, spatial frequency, orientation, and I'll just go through these parameters briefly to give you a flavour for how specific they are. First, size. The larger the pattern, the worse it is. And in fact, if you plot the probability of a paroxysmal EEG activity against the size of the pattern, it's linear with the area of the visual cortex to which the pattern projects. The next thing is spatial frequency. Now, by spatial frequency, I mean, if you imagine your fingernail at arm's length, that fingernail covers about 1 degree at the eye, and 3 cycles or stripes of the pattern in 1 degree is the worst. And then there's orientation. Some patients are sensitive to a limited range of orientation, which suggests that the seizures are triggered in a part of the visual cortex where there are neurons that are sensitive to orientation. And the length of lines is also important. So the longer the length of the line in a pattern, the greater the probability of seizure activity. Again, consistent with a cortical locus for the seizures. The duty cycle is critical. The mark space fraction, that is the ratio spacing to width of the lines. Contrast is important. The higher the contrast, the worse. And the luminance, the higher the luminance, the worse it is within mesopic and photopic levels. So down where the rods are active, there's not a problem. Now, the purpose for that little introduction may think, well, I don't have epilepsy, so not particularly interesting, but it is because the patterns don't only induce seizures. Exactly the same patterns induce illusions and discomfort. And some people are more susceptible to the illusions and discomfort. And interestingly, these are exacerbated by sleep loss. So if you go without sleep, you'll see far more illusions and discomfort when you look at patterns of stripes. And it's related to headache frequency. So if you have frequent headaches, you're also more likely to see illusions. Why on earth should that be the case? Why the same patterns producing illusions and discomfort and seizures, but more in some people than others? Well, it has to do with the strength of the excitation within the visual system. Now, we can measure that in several ways. One involves psychophysics. So if we reduce the contrast of the pattern down to very low levels, we can show that the patterns that provoke seizures are the ones that you can see most readily at low contrast. Another way is to look at the electrophysiology. So you measure the evoked potentials or you measure the EEG, and you show that you get a larger response from these patterns than from others. And nowadays, you can measure the hemodynamic response using fMRI or using near-infrared spectroscopy. And again, these patterns produce a large response. Now, why are these patterns responsible for strong excitation? There's a very good reason, actually, and it has to do with Charles Darwin and Horace Barlow. Now, Horace Barlow was professor of physiology in Cambridge, and you may not know, but he was actually Charles Darwin's grandson. So runs in the family. But Horace Barlow suggested early on that sensory systems, the systems whereby we see and hear and so on, are designed to be efficient, to use a minimum of metabolic energy. And that's, of course, the case with images from nature, because it's images from nature that we've evolved to process efficiently. Okay, so images from nature can be efficiently processed by the visual system. Now, I've shown you that flicker is rare in nature and stripes are rare in nature. They do occur, but they're rare. Now, we can measure, surprisingly, using mathematics, what it is about images from nature that means that they are efficiently processed. We can use something called the Fourier transform, which in natural images shows a linear relationship between the log amplitude of the Fourier components. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. I don't really either, but we can measure it mathematically. And the log of the spatial frequencies, a simple linear relationship. The orientation, there are more horizontal and vertical contours in natural images than in oblique ones. Color contrast. The contrasts within nature are relatively modest. Now, in all these ways, we can quantify images from nature. What I want to do now, just introduce you to this little paper I wrote this year, Visual Discomfort, Neural Inefficiency, and the Cortical Hemodynamic Response. Well, you don't need to read it. The bottom line is that scenes that share statistical properties, such as I've just described, with those of images from nature are more comfortable, give a smaller hemodynamic response, that is blood oxygenation response, and they're processed with less energy. The processing is more efficient, if you like. But interestingly, people who are prone to visual discomfort show a larger hemodynamic response. So the positive association between neural inefficiency on the one hand and discomfort on the other hand applies across scenes and across people. So it's for real. So let's apply this to the classroom. Now, classrooms differ from scenes in nature. They may therefore be uncomfortable, and the differences from nature occur temporally, spatially, and with respect to colour. They concern lighting, reading, and design. Now, electric lighting, a little history, because electric lighting flickers. It flickers very rapidly, 100 times a second, twice with each cycle of the electricity supply. Now, when lighting was generated by a hot filament, the hot filament didn't have time to cool down from one cycle of the mains to the next. So the flicker was relatively modest, somewhere between 5 and 15%, and you couldn't really see it. Then the gas discharge lighting was introduced in about the 50s and 60s. And this generated light in a completely different way. There was a hot filament at each end of a glass tube containing argon and mercury vapor, and lightning, as it were, a gas discharge, passes down the tube. Most of the energy from that discharge is in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, but it's converted to visible light by a phosphor coating on the inside of the tube. Now, this lightning goes to and fro twice with each cycle of the main, so at 100 hertz. But the phosphor coating retains some of the light from one cycle to the next. So the amount of modulation of light depends upon the phosphor coating. And since the phosphor coating is converting ultraviolet light to visible light, the color of the lamp changes as well as its brightness, 100 times a second. And that color can be resolved at the retina, that change in color. Now, we did a study way back in 1989 where we took lamps in a large office building in London and changed the circuitry within them from the magnetic ballast that's typically used that produces a 100 hertz flicker to electronic ballast, which produces flicker at 20 to 30 kilohertz. So, the flicker there doesn't matter too much. And we changed the circuitry without the people knowing which was which. So it was a double masked study. What we found was that on average, the number of headaches under the electronic ballast was halved. And that's without changing the lamps at all, just the circuitry in them. So that suggests that this 100 per second flicker that you get from fluorescent lighting, at least fluorescent lighting with a magnetic ballast, is bad for your health. Now, the electronic ballast was introduced and it's reduced the amount of flicker for a short time, but unfortunately, LEDs have been introduced, and whether they flicker or not depends entirely on the circuitry that's associated with them. And LEDs have now been made to replace fluorescent lamps. The amount of modulation or variation in brightness that you get from LEDs varies enormously. Some LEDs, like the one in the top left diagram here, don't flicker at all. Some, as you can see, flicker a huge amount. Some flicker just a little. So He pays your money and you takes your choice, except that you don't pay any more for lighting that doesn't flicker, interestingly. So recently I went into 4 schools in Norwich, around the Norwich area, and looked at the lighting. We found that anything went. So there's some of the lighting was fluorescent tubes of magnetic ballast, still, even today. Some were fluorescent tubes with electronic ballast, which was fine. Some were compact fluorescents, which sometimes flicker a bit. And then there were LEDs, LED bulbs, LED strips, and LED panels, some of which flickered and some of which didn't. How on earth can you tell whether they flicker or not? Well, there is a very simple way. This I've prepared for you. You can take a screen dump because it's something I've called an infographic. I was asked to produce an infographic, so here it is. A flicker that you can't see is bad for your health. School lighting often flickers. Flickers too rapid to see, but it can interfere with reading. I'll show you that later, and it can cause headaches. And these are the references. Now, to find out if your school lighting flickers, you use your smartphone. You find the camera, you select a video, and then you choose slow-mo video. And that will pick up 100 hertz flicker, which is the worst flicker. Some flickers much more frequently than that, but it's the 100 hertz flicker that's a major problem, and you can pick that up. And if you can see flicker, campaign for the lights to be changed, because most modern LED lighting doesn't flicker. It's quite possible to get circuitry that does not flicker now. But there's a legacy of poor lighting since about 2015 that we need to get rid of. Lighting that doesn't flicker does not cost any more. That's the bottom line. So that's an important message, I feel. We've got to get rid of the flicker in classrooms. Okay, so that scenes in the classroom are unlike those in nature with respect to lighting. Now I'm going to consider shape and colour. Okay, let's start with shape. And by shape, I'm not referring to lettering in children's books. Now, if you look at this young man in the front row, he's reading very close to the page. He can, because his eyes have got very good accommodation. He can focus very near to. But why does he focus so close to the page? It's because the lettering is not big enough. Let me explain. We looked at 2 reading schemes. This is the age in years, and this is the height in millimeters of the central body of the letters, called the X height. And you can see it starts off at about 4 or maybe 4.5 millimeters at age 5, and then goes down to about 2 millimeters, which is adult size at age 10. We prepared some text for the children to read, nonsense text. They just had to read the words aloud as fast as they could. And they read text designed for younger children faster than quotes age appropriate unquotes text. So their reading speed on this test was compromised by the size of the lettering they had to see. Now, okay, so this isn't natural reading, but to confirm it, we chose a natural reading task. We looked at speed of reading for comprehension. We prepared some sentences, and this is year 3 in a county primary school, and some of the sentences had an X height of 4.2 millimeters, some had an X height of 5 millimeters, which is far bigger than you ever get in textbooks. But there was a 9% difference in the speed of completion of the sentence completion task, favouring the large text. So again, reading text isn't big enough for children. Why isn't it big enough? Well, here's some unfamiliar orthography. It's Thai. And you can see that you'd have great difficulty deciphering the lettering here much easier on the right. So the text size makes an enormous difference when you're unfamiliar with the orthography, as children are. Whoops, before I show you this next stimulus, of course, it's a very unnatural stimulus. I've already shown you that it provokes headache and seizures, but this is a text that we look at every day. There's the lines, you see. You can measure the average density of the lines, and it's within the appropriate parameter range. Now, the fact that this is a pattern of stripes explains why, when you cover the stripes you're not reading, it can make the text much easier to see. This is the Prentice typoscope, which was invented in about 1890. Covering the lines above and below the ones that you're trying to read can improve the clarity of text for some people, particularly those affected by stripes. But, of course, it's a nuisance to use. You have to move it down the page, and it's not ideal. But why do the stripes of text have this effect? Well, I'll try and explain a little bit of Fourier analysis. If you look at this scene from nature and look at this particular sample here, I've enlarged it here, and I measured the luminance profile, the way in which the light value changes across space. And it has this waveform. And this waveform can be thought as being made up of a component that has a low spatial frequency and components with higher spatial frequency. And you'll notice that the high spatial frequency components have a lower amplitude. And if you plot the log amplitude against the log spatial frequency, you get 1 upon f, a straight line on log coordinates, 1 upon f. Now, a colleague of mine, Olivier Pinaccio, who's a good mathematician, tried doing that in 2 dimensions. So we have an image, and we've looked at the log spatial frequency in the vertical and a log spatial frequency along the horizontal. And what he suggested doing was to fit a cone, a 1 upon f cone, to the 2-dimensional image, right? And you can fit the best cone by least squares. And if you do, you have some of the residuals left over. Now, what's fascinating is that those residuals that are left over in the maths explain 50% of the variance in judgments of discomfort. So from simple mathematics, we can explain discomfort from a whole range of different images. What happens if we use this for text? Well, here is the residuals. So the higher the residuals, the more unlike nature it is, right? And here are samples of text. And this is the ratio of x height to line spacing. So the greater the space between the lettering, not the physical space, but the ratio of space to x height, the more natural it is. So it's becoming more and more comfortable with larger and larger spacing. So here we have an example of widely spaced text, nice and clear. And here we have a sample that's too close, difficult for children. And again, an example of unfamiliar orthography. Here's widely spaced text, you can see it clearly. And here's the same text closed up. So if you're unfamiliar with the orthography, spacing is everything. But there's another form of spacing that I want to talk about. And that concerns not the spacing between the lines of text, but the spacing between the letter strokes. Some text, such as in Times or Palatino, is very regular. All the letter strokes are very regularly spaced, as you can see. Other fonts are irregular. Arial and Badana, Google Open Sans, they're irregular. We can measure the regularity using this horizontal autocorrelation. So what we do is we have two versions of the word, and we move one version across the other. When they're in register, the correlations of 1, obviously, and as you move one across the other, so the correlation goes right down. And when one letter stroke is superimposed on its neighbour, then the correlation goes up again. And the height of this first peak in the autocorrelation is the critical thing. You'll notice it's much higher for mum than for over. Interestingly, it explains about fluent readers take 10% longer reading words that have higher horizontal autocorrelation than words that have low. So the simple spatial structure of the word determines their reading speed. Now, here's the autocorrelation peak for a large number of different fonts. And what you see is that the serif fonts, that is, the fonts with little curly bits on the ends of the letters, are in general, they have a higher autocorrelation peak than the sans serif fonts. But is that because of the serifs? Well, it isn't. No, because here are two fonts. This is Lucinda Bright, which is a serifed font, and this is a sans serif font, and they have exactly the same peak in the autocorrelation. So it's the design of the font, not the serifs, that's critically important. Some typographers like rhythm, as they call it. They like the spacing to be regular. That's not good. That's not good for the visual system because when you read, you make a series of saccades, rapid eye movements, jerks across the page. And when you make a jerk, a saccade, the eyes go out of alignment. They have to be realigned using slow eye movements when they land on a word. Now, we've shown that the process of realignment takes longer when the autocorrelation is high. That's because you've got similar images in the two eyes and they can get confused. They're self-similar. How does that apply in the classroom? Well, this is a font by Rosemary Sassoon. It's a beautiful font. And I know Rosemary, and I'm sorry to do this to her, but unfortunately, if you measure this font, it is very spatially periodic. It's got a very high autocorrelation. We showed that children were slower at reading this font that they were familiar with than Verdana, which they were unfamiliar with. So it does make a difference. The regularity of the letter strokes is critical. So, to conclude this bit, children's reading books need larger fonts, fonts with less regular letter strokes, text with more space between the lines, and of course it's not a good idea to superimpose text on pictures because it's difficult enough for children to segregate the shapes of letters, let alone the shapes of pictures underneath. Of course, there's another form of stripes in the classroom, and that's important because if you teach children in front of Venetian blinds, you're going to find they find it hard to look at you. And they find it hard because these stripes are really quite aversive. And when the sun comes through, they create a pattern that is frankly epileptogenic. So it's a good idea to talk, not to address the class not against the Venetian blinds, but elsewhere. Okay, so that's dealt with some aspects of shape in the classroom. I'm now going to talk about colour. Now, scenes from nature have a modest colour variation, chromaticity variation. That's shown in the green here. We can measure colour difference according to this measure here, and you can see that scenes from nature have a much lower value than scenes of works of art and so forth. And we showed this and it makes a difference to the comfort. So we asked people to rate works of art as comfortable or uncomfortable. And in general, the discomfort increased with the size of the colour difference. But it's not only works of art, it's very simple patterns. The same thing applies. It doesn't matter what colour, but it does matter how different the colours are. So the larger the difference in colour, the greater the discomfort. Not only the discomfort, but also the hemodynamic response. So we've measured the hemodynamic response using near-infrared spectroscopy, and you can see that the size of the response increases with the colour difference between the stripes. We weren't the first to do this. Well, maybe we were, but anyway, there's another article here from Nanjing in China looking at natural images and varying the saturation of colour. The central ones are more comfortable, and the central ones had the lowest oxyhemoglobin response, that is to say, the lowest amount of the smallest hemodynamic response. So these were being processed by the brain more efficiently than the high or low colour saturation of images. Here we are in the classroom. I hope that's not too nasty a shot, but you can see that the colour in many classrooms is extreme. Maybe that's too stimulating. Okay, so I've dealt with lighting, shape and colour, but now I want to go on to screens, because screens are everywhere now. They flicker, they display text, and they're strongly coloured. So why do they flicker? Well, pulse width modulation, or PWM, is used to control the luminance of the screens. So basically, they're flickered when they didn't have to, and they're turned off and then turned on again, and turned off and turned on again, in order to reduce the brightness. Now, we know that during a saccade, flicker can have an effect on some people at 11 kilohertz or higher in some people. The flicker is not seen as flicker, it's seen as a pattern that occurs on the retina as the eyes sweep across a flickering source. And the people who can see flicker at high frequencies tend to suffer eye strain. Whether they can see it or not depends on the speed of their saccades. That varies by a factor of 2 in the population, and the contrast sensitivity, how sensitive they are at seeing very low contrast, and that varies by a factor of 4. So taking these two together, you've got at least a factor of 8 or so variation between people, but some people are definitely affected by pulse width modulation. So what do we do about, oh, no, one other thing I need to mention. Here's an example of words with a high autocorrelation. Here's an example of words with low autocorrelation. You will probably find that this text is more difficult to read than that. You wouldn't be alone. I think there's about a 10% difference in reading speed. But the interesting thing is that if you illuminate this text with flickering light, even if the flicker is at 600 hertz, then you're more affected by the flicker than you are on this. And that suggests there's an interaction between the spatial pattern that's generated by the flicker and the spatial pattern from the text itself. So in other words, it's not sufficient for lighting designers to design lighting where people can't see the flicker, because even flicker you can't see affects the control of eye movements, and it affects the way in which the flicker and the spatial periodicity interact when you're reading. So advice on screen usage. Avoid organic LEDs, OLEDs. They're quite common in recent Apple phones, and they tend to use pulse width modulation, and some people don't like that. You can check for pulse width modulation frequency using this website, notebookcheck.com. So a good source, you can find your notebook on it and tell what pulse width modulation frequency they use. When you're reading, use a low autocorrelation font. I would suggest Google Open Sans because it's free and it has low periodicity. Space the lines of text if you possibly can and avoid strong color contrasts. You might even try colored backgrounds. Why should that make a difference? Well, now I'm going on to treatment of visual discomfort. This is the intuitive colorimeter, and these are the precision tints. This is a box. It illuminates text with colored light in such a way that you can vary the hue and the saturation independently without changing the brightness. And it allows people to find a color that makes the text more comfortable to see. And some people, most people, of course, choose a color. Here we are. Here's some controls, right? They tend to choose a color that lies on this line. This line is the Planckian radiator, the daylight locus. So this is what daylight does. It's, the setting sun is reddish, north light is bluish. They tend to choose colors that are close to that line. But look over here. These are patients who have migraine with aura. They're tending to choose colors well away from the Planckian radiator locus. Why? They're tending to choose strongly saturated colors. There's something that about color that is making it easier for them to see the text. And this may have something to do with the use of colored overlays for reading. These are the colored overlays that I designed. They're designed to be used two at a time if necessary. You can get all the colors in the center here from single overlays. You can combine neighboring colors here to get the colors on the outer surface, outer ring, I should say. But that means that you can obtain 30 different colors from just 10 overlays. Not all of the overlays that are now on the market, and there's a vast number, have that facility. But anyway, I want to introduce you to a reanalysis that's just been done by Dr. Jim Gilchrist. He looked at a paper of mine from 2001. Now, the important thing about this paper was that we tested all the 7 to 8-year-old children in 10 schools in the Norwich area without any attention to whether they were poor readers or so. We just tested all the children whose parents gave permission, and that was nearly all of them. What Jim has done is to look again at the prevalence of benefit from the overlays. And you can use a very conservative criterion. What he's done is to choose a p-value and select the difference that gives you that p-value from the sample variance. But let's look at the moderate ones. Let's concentrate on them. There are 15 out of the 226 children. That's 6.6%. 6.6% who are reading significantly faster. How much faster? Well, on average, they're reading 24.9 words per minute faster, or in the median, 22.5. So that's children here aged 7 to 8 in 10 schools. Here's another sample. Here, most of the children were tested, but not all. So it was there was some random sampling, but the results we get are broadly similar. The prevalence, as you were, is 10.8. And these are the confidence limits on the prevalence, given this moderate level of statistical significance. So the percentages varies from 3.3 to 9.9 here, and 5.6 is 16.0 there. And again, the increase in words per minute is large. So I think some children do benefit from overlays. And of course, that's more than one child in every class who will read significantly more quickly with an overlay. By significantly, I mean significantly statistically, and also significantly in the more general sense. I mean, the increase in reading speed is substantial. Now, these are children who need refraction, binocular vision testing, and overlays testing at age 7. I think all children should have that opportunity. Currently, they don't. So, some people have referred to the use of overlays as a neuro myth. I think that's rather sad. I think it's a mistake to dismiss the benefit from coloured overlays. Is that the last word? Well, not quite. A summary now follows. So these are my suggestions. Test for flicker using slow-mo on your smartphone. If the lighting flickers, campaign to change it. Select larger text if you can for children. A lot of children like small text because it means that they're good readers. So you need to deal with that stigma. But they will read more readily and more easily with larger text than they currently have. Avoid teaching in front of Venetian blinds. They're bad for you. Avoid bright, strongly saturated colours in the classroom. Well, classrooms that are full of opponent colours, not a good idea, generally. It hypes children up. They don't need to be hyped up. They're hyped up everywhere else. If you look at children's television, I mean, it's horribly hyped up. But anyway, that's another matter. Check if the words wobble on the page, and if they do, refer the child to an optometrist who has an interest in coloured overlays, and you can find them at this website. You can get more information at this website here too. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnold. That was really, really interesting. I'm gonna open the floor to, sorry, I'm just getting it back into a big screen. I'm gonna open the floor to questions. Please, you can put your hand up or you can put a question in the chat, entirely up to you. While people think about what they might want to ask, I will ask my question. So I am one of the people who has dismissed coloured overlays as a neuromyth and even did a little video explainer on it. But in my defense, what I actually said was that coloured overlays can improve reading, but it's for all children. It's not specific for as a treatment for children with dyslexia, because that's something else. And that even though if you get a sample of children, some have dyslexia and some don't, they will improve reading generally for all, maybe slightly more for children with dyslexia, but that was likely explained by noise from children with dyslexia having a sort of a more general aversion. So,
Well,
let's see.
I
But
entirely,
sorry.
I entirely agree.
Oh, okay. So my question was, what do you think?
Well, it's not dyslexia, no.
Right,
Well,
right.
difficulties of this kind can contribute to reading difficulty. Of course they can. Reading is extremely complex.
Yeah.
And I know that people who study dyslexia tend to hive off certain aspects of reading difficulty. But
Yeah.
the visual difficulties are things that have been overlooked. They're extremely important, and publishers need to deal with them.
Yes, yeah, no, I agree. And I've got some questions around it, but I'm not going to abuse my position as chair. I'm going to, Michael, do you want me to read out your question or do you want to stick your camera on and ask it? Where...
Oh, I'll maybe I'll read it out myself because I read it right at the beginning of the talk and now I can't really remember it. So yeah, I had two questions. I mean, one of them was really about the evolutionary account, and maybe that's not the most important aspect, but I'm just wondering how crucial a part of the story of visual discomfort that is, or whether it works just as well with a developmental account where you define unnatural stimuli with respect to early visual experience rather than some ancestral idea of natural environments.
I don't know. I don't know much about the diet early in life, but that is the visual diet. But I greatly respect Horace Barlow, who's kicked all this off. And I personally think that well, okay, start another way. Okay, here's another thought. If you build a computer model of the visual system, as has been done, and you give it uncomfortable things to look at, as has been done, what you find is that the neural brain, or the artificial brain, starts to behave just as we do. The neurons start to fire more strongly. There are more firing. And if you reduce the lateral interactions in that model, then you can explain the individual differences that seem to exist in the population. So I think we're getting close to a mechanistic explanation of visual discomfort, but that is entirely consistent with Horace Barlow's account in terms of efficiency. That would be my take on things.
Thank you.
I see you've got another question, Michael. I think half of it has been covered by my initial.
You sort of, yes, cover that. I mean, the neuromythical status of colored overlays is generally in response to the idea that they're a treatment for dyslexia.
Yeah.
And for sure, I think there's good evidence that you've presented and much of your work that color overlays for some children can improve reading rate. But for dyslexia, the key issue is about whether it improves reading accuracy, and in particular for irregular words, for novel words, and whether it improves reading for children with difficulties in phonological awareness.
Yes. Well, phonological awareness has become, well, Maggie Snowling made it dyslexia, didn't she, really? But dyslexia, as I said, is multifactorial. There are a lot of things that can lead to reading difficulties, one of which is text instability, perceptual instability. And if one can deal with that, as one can with overlays, then one can improve the reading. But it's not dyslexia. It depends how you define it, of course. But yeah. What else was I going to say? I've forgotten now. Sorry.
I've got
Great,
another
thanks.
question for you from Gabrielle. So we'll move to that one, and then I've got some more as well. So very interesting talk. Some children who read more quickly with an overlay also benefit from vision therapy. Can you speak to the relationship between factors related to eye muscles and more central cortical impacts on processing?
Yes, to a degree. There are various tests of binocular function, and some of those tests, you measure the extent to which the two eyes are seeing the same thing and follow one another. And very often those tests improve with color, which of course they shouldn't if it's just a binocular vision problem. So we're looking at the function of the brain and eye muscles together. And I think optometrists tend to think largely of the muscles, not the brain. And maybe if the number of children in whom color improves binocular function are counted, then it might become clear that it's doing both things, really. The best person to ask for this, of course, is a colleague of mine, Bruce Evans, but he's not here on this call.
So Andy has a question, has his hand up.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's not so much a question as an observation. Really interesting listening to your talk on after having spent most of the day in a primary school. And I noticed quite strikingly that all the kind of notice boards and things within the school have been replaced with Hessian backing, which of course mutes down the tone completely. And I thought at the time, well, that's very interesting because it's making the classroom seem like a less busy environment. But I suppose if there's a question here, I wondered how far you think schools are aware of these kinds of issues, because that seems to be quite a striking change that they've made. I've no idea what the rationale for it was from their part. But
No, I don't think they're very aware of it. They're not really aware of the flicker problem either, which they need to be, because unfortunately, the procurement of the lighting refitting of lighting is left to the janitor, really. And there's no reason why he should be informed to sufficiently to put the right lighting in. It's not easy, because the firms that sell it very often, some of them know what they're talking about, some of them don't, and it's important to check the lighting, as I do with my smartphone, before it goes in.
So I've got two questions in the chat from Sophia and Tracy, and then I will come to you, Magdalena. So Sophie says, thanks for an interesting talk. I'm interested in the idea of visual discomfort, but I'm relatively new to the idea. How do you think people are at rating their own visual discomfort? If you ask people how they're making these decisions, would they mention colours explicitly? Is there a large variation between and within individuals?
There is a large variation between people, but in general, if you ask them whether something's comfortable and give them a Likert scale to just report their degree of discomfort, they're remarkably consistent. It is extraordinary to think, isn't it, really, that you can ask people to look at a whole series of photographs or a whole series of coloured modern art and to say how comfortable they find it. And lo and behold, you can predict their rating mathematically. There's something fairly deep going on, I feel.
I see Tracy's question. Delighted to have a question from you, Tracy. And I'm going to tack my question on the end of it because it's sort of related. So she said, fascinated by the typeface discussion and spacing. Has there been research on whether spacing between letters, spacing between words, or line spacing has more of an impact on child reading abilities? And are publishers aware of this? And my question was whether you have measured the impact of typeface on how long children can read. So not how quickly they read, but how long they can actually sit and read and engage with the text.
No,
so kind of merge them together.
No, I should like to do that, but I haven't yet. What we have done, the parameters you mentioned, the typographic parameters and spacing of lines, letters, and words, and they all interact with one another mathematically. That's the problem. They're not independent. So, for example, we did do a little study where I gave some students iBooks, and they were asked to make the text more comfortable by choosing what Apple gives you for adjusting they could adjust the font, they could adjust the spacing, and so on. But none of the typographic parameters predicted their final choice. But the mathematics did. So if you just looked at the Fourier transform, it predicted the choice. They tended to choose text that was mathematically more similar to natural scenes. So we had to consider all the typographic parameters together, right? Can't consider them in isolation.
Okay, thank you. So Magdalena, do you want to ask your question? And then I'll come to you, Irini, in the chat.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for a really interesting topic, and it was really new for me. I myself am really interested in discomfort with sound, especially like in classroom and so on. And your presentation has started to me to wonder, is there any correlation between visual discomfort and sound discomfort? Like how, if those two conclude to each other, how does it affect the children's academic steps, etc.?
Thank you. That's a question I can answer. The people who are sensitive to patterns, visually sensitive, are also sensitive to sound. There's a strong correlation. And of course, the people who are on the autistic spectrum are quite sensitive generally. What's interesting, though, is if you try and deal with the noise by dampening it down using acoustic paneling
Mm.
in lecture theatres, for example, what you end up generating is extremely uncomfortable patterning. And that's because the wavelength of sound that predicts the spacing of the holes that you put in the board, and that makes for an uncomfortable pattern. There have been some examples, and if anyone knows of more examples, I'd be glad to hear of them, of lecture theatres where they've actually had to cover up the paneling because of complaints. So yes, yes, both visual and acoustic problems. And if you want to, there's a paper by my former student called Sarah Haig I forgot, I don't know the journal now, but it's on my site, I think. But anyway, if get in touch, I can send you the paper.
Yes, please. Thank you.
So a question from Irini from our department has said, how can you measure visual discomfort in very young children? So I'm assuming before they've learnt to read.
Well, preferential looking is the classic way of measuring infants' vision, but it might also be measuring their preference, mightn't it? I don't know, is the honest answer, but I would have thought that discomfort would certainly affect their preferential looking, wouldn't you?
Yes, well, that's what that was my sort of suspicion, but I was just wondering whether you have any better ideas, so to speak.
Well, we don't want to give them seizures, but fortunately, seizures in infancy are relatively, the brain has to develop before you tend to get light-sensitive seizures. So I don't think we need to worry about, and migraine takes time to develop. So I don't think we need to worry on that score, but it would be very interesting to see if the images, say, of modern art that adults find uncomfortable to look at are also the ones that infants tend to gaze away from. I would have thought that was quite likely, actually.
Right, thank you.
It would change the whole field on preferential looking, wouldn't it? If we could predict infants' preference on the basis of the Fourier transform.
There's another question from Michael, but by your leave, Michael, I'm going to come back to you and ask Panos's question first. I think Panos is an ex-student of yours. So he said again, thank you for the interesting talk. He was wondering, are some alphabets more susceptible to visual discomfort than others?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ours isn't very good. But if you look at Arabic, it's so beautifully clear from this point of view. It doesn't have periodic patterns. You saw Thai. I showed you some passages of Thai. That's pretty bad. But yeah, the spatial periodicity is what's key, and it's absent in Arabic. It's present in Hindi. Interestingly, you get the same effect in Hindi. That people find Hindi that has high autocorrelation slow to read.
Thank you. Got a question from Joe who said reading rate is of course important, but does it affect their comprehension as well? And I think you presented some data on that, but I don't recall.
Yeah, it's only a little study, but yes, it does affect their comprehension. The reason I know that the rate of reading test that I developed is artificial. I know reading randomly ordered common words is at one level silly, but the other level, what it does is to avoid the variance due to comprehension, and enables you to get a sensitive measure very quickly that's sensitive to typographic features of the page as well as the color, and sensitive to problems of binocularity and stuff like that. So it's a very sensitive measure. But I agree that comprehension is where it's at from an education point of view, and it would be very nice to, well, we did a study early on that showed that children don't, if they're reading for comprehension natural prose, then they will do so, but they will slow up. So over the course of 15 minutes, they will slow up, and then the overlays have their effect in the last 5 minutes or so of their reading. Initially, they're able to overcome the discomfort, but then eventually it sets in. And that's why we developed the rate of reading test, because you want something that's much quicker to measure. But yes, I mean, it will affect comprehension in the long term for sure. Yeah. Well, I say for sure. Be demonstrated, perhaps. I'm fairly confident you would.
I think I'm going to squeeze in. There's 3 more questions, one from me, one from Michael, and one from Tracy, and I am going to deprioritize CEN members and allow Tracy's question. Tracy is asking, have there been any studies comparing student learning in school settings that prioritize natural colors and settings versus those that use bright colors, like the ones in your slide? And does this fall under ergonomics in schools, or is there another term?
Not that I know of. There may be. We did do a little study of Peppa Pig. And this was with undergraduates, so they weren't young children. But we showed that reducing the saturation of Peppa Pig made it more comfortable to look at. If you think Peppa Pig's nice because they're all very straightforward coloured shapes, and so you can measure them, the colour contrast easily. But I don't have any other studies to report, I'm afraid.
Okay, we have gone 2 minutes over time, but lots of it was so interesting, Arnold. Thank you. And I've still got some questions, which I think I will email you. If that's okay. But yeah, I just want to say thank you and let everybody know that this has been recorded, so it will be on the YouTube channel when we get to that. But yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's get my reaction to clap. There we go. Are you heading straight off, Arnold, or did you want to stay and ask any question?
I might. I'm happy. I mean, I'm retired, so I've got all the time.
You've got all the time in the world. I do have sorry, I have something here. No, I will end the call in 1 second, but I was just wondering if you had anything in particular that you wanted to ask me.